Montana Territory, 1871. The winter had finally released its icy grip on the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains, where the small settlement of Pine Creek clung to existence like a stubborn patch of lichen on stone. Spring brought with it the promise of new beginnings, but for Wade McAllister, the changing seasons meant nothing more than different challenges to overcome in the endless struggle to survive the frontier. At 25, Wade had the weathered eyes of a man twice his age, though his strong jaw and full head of dark brown hair still betrayed his youth. The years of hard living had toughened his lean frame but hadn't diminished his handsome features, high cheekbones, straight nose, and lips that rarely smiled. He'd spent the last 3 years working as a ranch hand for the Double H, building a reputation as a skilled horseman who could break the wildest mustangs and track lost cattle across the harshest terrain. What few people knew was that Wade carried a conviction deeper than the mountain valleys he called home, that a man survived longest in the West by keeping to himself. His father had taught him that lesson before a Blackfoot arrow found his heart, and his mother reinforced it before consumption took her 2 winters later. By 18, Wade was alone, and he'd come to believe that's how a man was meant to be out here. Love and attachment were luxuries that got people killed in a land that took more than it gave. McAllister. "Get your gear together," barked Hank Harrison, the grizzled owner of the Double H, as Wade finished mucking out the last stall in the barn. "Supply wagon from Helena's 3 days late, and I need someone to ride out and make sure Davidson hasn't gotten himself robbed or stuck in a ditch." Wade nodded once, showing neither excitement nor reluctance at the prospect of a 3-day ride each way. "I'll head out at first light. Take the North Trail through Settlers Pass," Harrison added. "There's been talk of Bannock war parties to the east." Another nod and Wade returned to his work. The prospect of a week alone on the trail didn't bother him. In fact, he preferred it to the forced sociability of the bunkhouse. Out there, a man could hear himself think, could let the mask drop for a while. The wilderness didn't care if you smiled or frowned, if you spoke or stayed silent. It simply demanded respect and caution, terms that Wade found far more straightforward than the complex expectations of town life. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor hues as Wade guided his sturdy buckskin gelding, Coyote, along the narrow trail that wound through pine-covered foothills. The saddlebags held enough provisions for the journey, and his Winchester rifle rested securely in its scabbard. The morning air still carried winter's bite, but his sheepskin coat kept the chill at bay. By midday, Wade had covered considerable ground, the Double H far behind him as the trail began its gradual climb towards Settlers Pass. It was there, at the bend of Wolf Creek, that the silence of his journey was broken by the unmistakable sound of gunfire, 3 shots in rapid succession, followed by a woman's scream that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Wade drew his rifle and urged Coyote forward, approaching with the caution of a man who knew that heroics often got good men killed. Cresting a small rise, he took in the scene below. A small wagon with one wheel broken, a body sprawled face down in the dirt, and 2 rough-looking men advancing on a young woman who had backed herself against a large boulder, a small derringer clutched in her trembling hand. "That's far enough," she warned, her voice stronger than her shaking hands suggested. "I know how to use this." One of the men, sporting a filthy red bandana around his neck, laughed. "That little pea-shooter. You'll get 1 shot and then what?" He took another step forward. "Now be reasonable, we just want the strongbox. Your pa there already made his choice." Wade sized up the situation in seconds. The woman's father was clearly dead, and she was moments away from joining him. These weren't just opportunistic thieves. The methodical way they approached, keeping distance between them to complicate her aim, marked them as experienced predators. He had a clear shot at the man with the bandana, but the second attacker was partially obscured by a stand of young aspens. Wade knew the odds. Even if he dropped one, the other might get to the woman before he could reload. And involving himself in strangers' troubles went against everything he'd learned about survival. Yet something, perhaps the defiant tilt of the woman's chin as she faced her likely death, made his decision for him. "Might be a good time to reconsider your plans, gentlemen," Wade called out, his rifle trained on the man in the bandana. Both attackers froze, eyes darting to locate the new threat. "This ain't your concern, Cowboy," the second man growled, his hand hovering near his holstered pistol. "It is now," Wade replied evenly. "The lady doesn't seem interested in your company, and I'm not particularly fond of 2-against-1 odds." Well, now it's 2 against 2, Bandana sneered, his hand inching toward his gun. Not exactly, Wade said, squeezing the trigger. The rifle's report echoed through the valley as Bandana dropped, clutching his shoulder. His companion drew and fired wildly, the bullet splintering bark from a tree several feet to Wade's left. Wade's second shot was more precise, catching the man in the leg and sending him sprawling. Next one goes through your heart, Wade warned, chambering another round. Drop the gun and start walking. Don't stop till you reach the territorial line. The wounded men exchanged glances, calculating their odds. Self-preservation won out. The second man tossed his pistol aside, helped his bleeding companion to his feet, and the two limped away, trailing curses and blood. Only when they disappeared from sight did Wade approach the woman, who still stood with her back to the boulder, the small derringer now pointed uncertainly in his direction. I'm not going to hurt you, ma'am, he said, lowering his rifle. Name's Wade McAllister, ranch hand at the Double H. The woman didn't lower her gun immediately, which Wade respected. Trust came dear on the frontier, and she'd just seen how quickly strangers could turn deadly. Catherine, she finally said, the derringer dropping to her side. Catherine Forrester. Wade got his first good look at her then, and something in his chest tightened. She was young, perhaps 20, with hair the color of wheat fields in late summer, pulled back in a practical braid that had partially come undone in the struggle. Her dress was simple but well-made, dark blue calico now smudged with dust. Her eyes, the clear blue of mountain lakes, were rimmed red but dry. She was beautiful in the way of frontier women, with a strength that complemented rather than contradicted her delicate features. I'm sorry about your father, Wade said, glancing at the still form by the wagon. He's not my father, she replied, her voice steadier now. Was Mr. Davidson, the freight driver. I paid for passage to Pine Creek. Wade's eyebrows rose slightly. Davidson was the very man he'd been sent to find. The supply wagon for the Double H, he stated rather than asked. Catherine nodded. Yes. We were delayed leaving Helena because of axle troubles, and then, her voice faltered as she looked at Davidson's body. Those men, Wade prompted. They mentioned a strongbox. The wagon's carrying payroll for the mining company in Silver Creek, she explained. Along with your ranch supplies, Mr. Davidson thought we'd be safer traveling together. A bitter smile touched her lips. He was wrong. Wade moved to the wagon, examining the broken wheel. We'll need to bury him, he said practically, then see about fixing this wheel. Something about his matter-of-fact approach seemed to steady her. Catherine straightened her shoulders and nodded. I'll get his blanket, she said, moving toward the wagon. They worked together in silence, Wade digging a grave while Catherine gathered stones to mark it. The simplicity of the tasks, practical, necessary, created a temporary bridge between them. When they stood over the finished grave, Catherine recited the Lord's Prayer in a clear voice that carried across the empty landscape. Wade kept his hat in his hands and his thoughts to himself. The wheel took longer to fix, requiring Wade to fashion a temporary replacement from a section of fallen pine. By the time the wagon was serviceable, the afternoon was waning. We won't make it to the ranch today, Wade said, securing the last rope that held the makeshift wheel in place. There's a line shack about an hour from here. We can shelter there tonight. Catherine hesitated, clearly weighing the propriety of spending the night alone with a stranger against the dangers of the open trail. I'll sleep outside, Wade added, reading her concern. She shook her head. After what happened today, I'd rather have you nearby. Something flickered in her eyes, not fear of him, but of being alone. I trust you, Mr. McAllister. The words struck Wade with unexpected force. Trust was currency he rarely traded in. Wade, he corrected, just Wade. The line shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a small stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a single narrow bed. While Catherine settled inside, Wade tended to the horses and brought in enough firewood to last the night. By the time he returned with their supplies, she had swept the floor and was attempting to light the fire with hands that still trembled slightly. Wade knelt beside her, gently taking the flint. Let me, he said. Their fingers brushed, and he noticed for the first time a glimpse of something beneath her sleeve, a band of reddened, puckered skin circling her right wrist. She pulled her hand back quickly, tugging her sleeve down to cover it. The fire caught, casting warm light across the cabin's interior. Wade busied himself preparing a simple meal from his provisions: beans, jerky, and hardtack softened in the beans' broth. They ate in silence until Catherine finally spoke. "Thank you," she said, "for intervening for all of this." Her gesture encompassed the fire, the food, the safety of walls around them. Wade nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "No," she said firmly, "they wouldn't have. Most men would have ridden past, not wanting to involve themselves in someone else's troubles." Wade couldn't argue with that assessment. It's exactly what he would have advised another man to do. Yet here he was, sharing beans with a stranger because something about her had made him act against his own rules of survival. "What brings you to Pine Creek?" he asked, changing the subject. "A fresh start," she replied, her fingers unconsciously touching her covered wrist. "I've accepted a position as a teacher." The settlement advertised back east for someone to establish a proper school. "Pine Creek's growing," Wade acknowledged. "Enough children now to need schooling, I suppose." "And what about you?" she asked. "Have you been at the Double H long?" 3 years, he didn't elaborate. Catherine seemed to sense his reluctance to talk about himself. She asked instead about the ranch, about Pine Creek and its residents, questions Wade could answer without revealing anything personal. As she spoke and listened, the tension gradually left her shoulders, though her hand occasionally drifted to her right wrist in an unconscious gesture. When the meal was finished and the fire burned low, Wade stood. "You take the bed, I'll be comfortable enough by the fire." Catherine didn't argue, though she insisted on using her own blankets from her trunk rather than the questionable bedding in the shack. As she arranged her makeshift bed, Wade stepped outside, checking once more on the horses and scanning the darkness for any signs of trouble. The night was clear, stars scattered like spilled sugar across the black expanse. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonesome cry echoing Wade's own solitary existence. For the first time in years, that solitude didn't feel like the comfort it usually did. Inside, Catherine had changed into a modest nightdress, her traveling clothes neatly folded beside her trunk. She sat on the edge of the bed, brushing out her long blonde hair. The domestic scene hit Wade with unexpected force. This glimpse of gentle normalcy seemed to belong to another world entirely, not to the harsh landscape outside. "Good night, Wade," she said softly as he settled by the fire, his saddle as a pillow. "Good night, Miss Forrester." "Catherine," she corrected, echoing his earlier words. "Just Catherine." In the flickering firelight, Wade watched as she tucked herself beneath her blankets, turning to face the wall. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into sleep, the events of the day having exhausted her beyond fear or caution. Wade lay awake longer, his thoughts unexpectedly turbulent. Who was this woman who had appeared so suddenly on his trail? What was she running from with her talk of fresh starts and the burn mark he'd glimpsed on her wrist? And why did he find himself caring about the answers? Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the shack's single window. Wade had already been up for an hour, checking the wagon, tending the horses, and preparing coffee over a rekindled fire. When Catherine emerged from the cabin, she had transformed herself back into the composed young woman of yesterday, her hair neatly braided, her blue dress brushed clean of dust. "You're an early riser," she noted, accepting the tin cup of coffee he offered. "Sun doesn't wait for a man out here," Wade replied. "We should reach the Double H by mid-afternoon if we start soon." They made good time, the makeshift wheel holding better than Wade had expected. Catherine drove the wagon while he rode alongside on Coyote, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. The conversation between them was sparse but not uncomfortable, practical exchanges about the trail, brief observations about the landscape, necessary communications between travel companions. It was during a stop to rest the horses that Wade finally asked the question that had been hovering at the edge of his thoughts. "The men yesterday," he began, watching her carefully, "they seemed to know exactly what the wagon was carrying." "How did they know about the payroll?" Catherine's hands stilled on the water canteen she'd been filling. "I've been wondering the same thing. Mr. Davidson was very careful. He didn't discuss the contents with anyone in Helena that I saw." She hesitated. "The mining company must have a leak somewhere." Wade nodded slowly. It made sense, yet something about the attack still troubled him. The men had seemed too prepared, too confident in their approach. "We should be cautious," he said finally. "Those two might have friends." Catherine's expression tightened, but she nodded. I've had enough experience with men like that to know they rarely work alone. The admission slipped out before she could stop it, and Wade saw her immediate regret. Her hand moved instinctively to her right wrist, confirming his suspicion that the burn he'd glimpsed was connected to whatever she was running from. They continued their journey in silence, the easy companionship of the morning giving way to a palpable tension. When the buildings of the Double H finally came into view, the main house, bunkhouse, barn, and various outbuildings scattered across the valley floor, Wade felt an unexpected reluctance to reach their destination. Hank Harrison emerged from the barn as they approached, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile at the sight of the supply wagon. "McAllister, damn good to see you got through." His eyes shifted to Catherine. "And who might this be?" "Miss Catherine Forrester," Wade replied. "She was traveling with Davidson. Bandits attacked them on the trail. Davidson didn't make it." Harrison's expression sobered. "My condolences, Miss Forrester." "Frank Davidson was a good man." He turned back to Wade. "The bandits. 2 of them wounded but alive. They were after the mining payroll." Harrison's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Payroll, eh? Well, that explains a few things. There's been talk of a gang working these parts." He gestured toward the main house. "Come on inside, Miss Forrester. The missus will get you settled. I expect you could use some proper food and rest." Catherine glanced at Wade, a moment of uncertainty crossing her face. He realized with some surprise that she was reluctant to part from him, the only familiar element in this new place. "I need to see to the horses," Wade said. "I'll bring your trunk to the house after." She nodded, understanding the unspoken reassurance. "Thank you, Wade, for everything." As Catherine followed Harrison toward the main house, Wade led the wagon team and Coyote to the barn, aware of the curious stares from the other ranch hands. It wasn't often that Wade McAllister returned from a solitary mission with a beautiful young woman in tow. "That's quite a replacement for old Davidson," drawled Jim Rollins, the oldest of the hands, as he helped Wade unhitch the team. "Where'd you find her?" "Bandits hit Davidson's wagon," Wade replied tersely. "She was traveling to Pine Creek, new schoolteacher." Rollins whistled low. "Schoolteacher, eh? Well, that'll put some life into Pine Creek. The Peterson boys might even learn to read after all." Wade ignored the banter, focusing on the tasks at hand. Yet as he worked, his thoughts kept straying to Catherine, to the quiet strength she'd shown after witnessing a man's murder, to the mystery of the burn on her wrist, to the way the morning light had caught in her hair as they'd traveled together. It was foolishness, he knew. In a few days she would be in Pine Creek, teaching children their letters, and he would return to the rhythm of ranch life that had defined his existence for the past 3 years. Their paths had crossed briefly, nothing more. Yet when he carried her trunk to the main house later that afternoon, he found himself hoping for another glimpse of her, perhaps a moment of conversation away from Harrison and his wife. Instead, he was greeted by Martha Harrison, who took the trunk with a knowing smile. "Miss Forrester's resting," she said. "Poor thing's been through a terrible ordeal by her account." "Good thing you were there, Wade." Wade nodded, uncomfortable with the approval in her voice. "Just doing what was needed, ma'am." "Well, she'll be staying with us until Saturday, when Josiah Fletcher makes his supply run to Pine Creek. You'll join us for supper tonight, won't you, in the main house?" The invitation was unexpected. Ranch hands rarely ate with the owners, and Wade preferred the simplicity of bunkhouse meals to the formality of the main table. "That's not necessary, Mrs. Harrison." "It wasn't a request, Wade," Martha said firmly. 7 o'clock and wash up properly." Wade found himself at the Harrison dinner table that evening, uncomfortably aware of his freshly scrubbed hands and damp hair. Catherine sat across from him, transformed by a few hours of rest and the loan of one of Martha's dresses, a simple affair of deep green that complemented her fair complexion and brought out the gold in her hair. The conversation flowed around him, Harrison discussing ranch business, Martha inquiring about Catherine's background and teaching experience, Catherine answering with poise that revealed a good education and careful upbringing. Wade contributed little beyond "yes, sir," and "no, ma'am," yet he found himself attuned to every word Catherine spoke, building a picture of the woman behind the composed exterior. She had grown up in Boston, the daughter of a professor who believed in educating girls as thoroughly as boys. Her mother had died when Catherine was 14, leaving her to keep house for her father until his death the previous year. The teaching position in Montana Territory represented both necessity and opportunity, a chance to support herself and to see a part of the country her father had often spoken about but never visited. It was a neat, logical narrative that explained her presence in Pine Creek, yet Wade sensed the gaps in her story, the unspoken reasons that had driven a well-educated Boston woman to seek a teaching position in one of the roughest territories in the West. The burn on her wrist, carefully concealed beneath the long sleeves of Martha's dress, suggested a chapter she had deliberately omitted. After dinner, Harrison invited Wade to join him for a cigar on the porch, a rare honor that spoke to his approval of Wade's handling of the Davidson situation. As the men stepped outside, Wade caught a final glimpse of Catherine helping Martha clear the table, her movements graceful and sure. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of the strange bond forged by shared danger. The next 2 days established a pattern. Wade went about his ranch duties, breaking a new Mustang for Harrison's remuda, mending fences along the north pasture, and helping to inventory the supplies that had arrived with Davidson's wagon. Catherine remained at the main house with Martha, occasionally visible from a distance as she helped with household tasks or sat reading on the porch. They encountered each other at meals and in passing, exchanging brief pleasantries that revealed nothing of the connection Wade had felt during their journey together. It was on the evening before Catherine was scheduled to leave for Pine Creek that Wade found her alone, standing at the corral fence watching as he worked with a half-broken buckskin mare. The horse was still skittish, accepting the saddle but resisting the bit with tossing head and rolling eyes. "She's beautiful," Catherine called as Wade led the mare in a tight circle, gradually shortening the lead rope. "What's her name?" "Doesn't have one yet," Wade replied, keeping his voice low and even to avoid startling the nervous animal. "Harrison names them after they're broken." Catherine approached the fence cautiously, respecting the horse's wariness. "She reminds me of a mare my father once owned. We called her Sunshine for her color." The buckskin's ears pricked forward at the sound of Catherine's voice, her head turning with interest toward the fence. "She likes you," Wade observed. "I've always had a way with nervous creatures," Catherine said with a small smile. "My father said it was because I move slowly and speak softly." She extended her hand palm up along the fence rail, not reaching for the horse but allowing her to investigate if she chose. To Wade's surprise, the skittish mare stretched her neck, nostrils flaring as she caught Catherine's scent. After a moment's consideration, she took a hesitant step forward. "Well, I'll be damned," Wade murmured. "She's barely let me near her all day." "Sometimes," Catherine said as the mare's soft muzzle finally touched her palm, "the ones that seem most afraid are just waiting for a reason to trust." Her eyes lifted from the horse to meet Wade's, and he had the distinct impression she was no longer talking about the buckskin. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions. Then Martha's voice called from the house, breaking the spell. "Catherine, there you are. I've ironed your blue dress for tomorrow's journey." Catherine's hand dropped from the horse, who snorted and backed away. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison," she called back. "I'll be right there." She turned to Wade, hesitating as if there was something more she wanted to say. Instead, she simply nodded. "Good luck with her. I think she'll come around." Wade watched her walk back to the house, her wheat blonde hair catching the last of the evening light. The mare nudged his shoulder impatiently, drawing his attention back to the task at hand, but his thoughts remained divided. That night, unable to sleep in the stuffy bunkhouse, Wade stepped outside for some air. The ranch lay quiet under a canopy of stars, the only sounds the occasional stamp of horses in the corral and the distant howl of a coyote. As he leaned against the bunkhouse wall, he noticed a figure moving near the main house, Catherine, wrapped in a shawl, walking slowly toward the garden that Martha tended with pride. Without conscious decision, Wade found himself following, keeping a respectful distance but drawn to her solitary vigil. She hadn't seen him yet, her attention fixed on the night sky as she settled on the bench beneath Martha's apple tree, now covered in pale blossoms. "Couldn't sleep?" Wade asked softly, not wanting to startle her. Catherine turned, unsurprised by his presence. "The house is too quiet," she admitted. "I've grown used to the sounds of the trail, I suppose." Wade understood. After days in the open, walls could feel confining rather than protective. May I? He gestured to the empty space beside her on the bench. She nodded, shifting slightly to make room. For a while they sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, so different from the wild music of the open country they'd traveled through, yet similar in its rhythmic constancy. "Are you nervous?" Wade finally asked. "About Pine Creek?" Catherine considered the question. "Yes," she said honestly, "but also hopeful. I've never taught before, not formally. In Boston, I tutored some neighborhood children, but this will be different." "The children here are different," Wade acknowledged. "Tougher in some ways, they grow up fast in the territory, but they're eager to learn, most of them." "You sound like you know them well." Wade shrugged. "I've delivered supplies to the settlement, seen the children running wild. They need someone like you." "Someone like me?" Catherine echoed, curiosity in her voice. "Someone who understands that gentleness can exist alongside strength," Wade said, the words coming from a place he rarely accessed. "The West teaches hard lessons, but that doesn't mean learning has to be harsh." Catherine studied him in the moonlight, her expression thoughtful. "You're not what you first appear, Wade McAllister." "Neither are you," he replied, his eyes dropping briefly to her right wrist, where the sleeve of her nightdress had risen slightly, revealing the edge of the burn mark. Catherine followed his gaze and didn't pull away this time. Instead, she slowly pushed the sleeve up, exposing the full extent of the scar, a band of puckered tissue that encircled her wrist completely, the mark of something that had bound her tightly enough to burn. Wade saw the burn mark on her wrist and went silent, his eyes lifting to meet hers with questions he didn't voice. "My late husband's idea of discipline," Catherine said quietly. "He believed a wife should be punished for disobedience." The simple statement hung in the night air between them. Wade felt something cold and hard form in his chest, anger, but also understanding. The missing piece of her story slotted into place. "You're a widow," he said, not a question but a realization. "Yes, Theodore died 6 months ago." No grief colored her voice, only a flat statement of fact. "Thrown from his horse while drunk, the neighbors called it a tragedy. I called it deliverance." Her candor was startling, but Wade sensed she needed to speak the truth aloud, perhaps for the first time. "The teaching position," Wade prompted gently. "A way out, a chance to start again where no one knows me as Theodore Forrester's pitiful wife." She tugged her sleeve down, covering the scar. "I didn't lie about wanting to teach. I've always wanted to. Theodore wouldn't allow it, said no wife of his would work like a common servant, but I'm not his wife anymore." Wade listened, understanding more than she realized. Everyone in the West was running from something, a past, a mistake, a crime, or simply the crushing weight of civilization's expectations. The frontier offered reinvention to those brave enough to seize it. "Pine Creek doesn't need to know," he said finally. "Your past is your own." Gratitude flickered in her eyes. "Thank you," she hesitated, then added, "I don't usually tell people. But after what happened on the trail, after you saved my life, it seemed wrong to keep hiding it from you." The admission touched something in Wade, a recognition of the trust she was placing in him. Few people in his life had ever deemed him worthy of such confidence. "We should both get some rest," he said, standing. "Fletcher leaves early for Pine Creek." Catherine nodded, rising from the bench. As they walked back toward the main house, she surprised him by lightly touching his arm. "Will I see you again, Wade, after tomorrow?" The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Wade thought of his solitary existence, of the walls he'd built around himself since his parents' deaths. He thought of the rules he lived by, the conviction that attachment was a weakness a man couldn't afford in the unforgiving West. Then he thought of Catherine facing down armed men with nothing but a derringer and raw courage, of her gentle hands coaxing trust from a frightened horse, of the scar she bore without letting it define her. "Pine Creek's only half a day's ride," he said. "I deliver supplies there sometimes." It wasn't a promise, but it was more than he'd offered anyone in years. Catherine seemed to understand the significance of even this small concession. "Good night, Wade," she said softly, before slipping back into the house. Wade stood for a long moment in the yard, looking up at the star-filled sky and wondering at the strange turn his life had taken. A simple supply run had somehow led him here, contemplating a future that included someone beyond survival. The morning brought a flurry of activity as Josiah Fletcher's wagon was loaded with supplies for Pine Creek. Catherine's trunk was secured in the back, and Martha fussed over her with motherly concern, providing a basket of food for the journey and extracting promises of letters to follow. Wade kept his distance, busying himself with ranch chores, yet he found himself tracking the preparations from the corner of his eye. He hadn't planned to see Catherine off, such gestures weren't his way, but as Fletcher prepared to depart, he found himself walking toward the wagon. Catherine saw him approaching and stepped away from Martha's embrace to meet him halfway. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion Wade could see in her eyes. "For everything." Wade nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude yet unwilling to dismiss it. "You take care in Pine Creek," he said. "And if you ever need," he stopped, uncertain how to complete the offer. "I know," Catherine said, understanding what he couldn't articulate. "The same goes for you, Wade McAllister. If you ever need a friend in Pine Creek, you know where to find me." The simplicity of the word friend belied the complexity of what had grown between them in such a short time. Wade had no friends, only employers and fellow workers. The concept was almost as foreign to him as the strange tightness in his chest as he watched her climb onto the wagon seat beside Fletcher. As the wagon pulled away, Catherine turned once to look back, raising her hand in a gesture that seemed both farewell and invitation. Wade lifted his hand in response, feeling as though something essential was departing with her. Harrison appeared beside him, watching the wagon grow smaller on the horizon. "Fine woman," he commented. "Pine Creek's lucky to have her." Wade nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "You know," Harrison continued casually, "we'll need to send some men to Pine Creek next week. That new corral they're building needs proper hardware, and Fletcher forgot half the supplies they ordered. Thought you might want to handle it." Wade glanced at his employer, suspecting the convenient errand wasn't entirely coincidental. Harrison's weathered face revealed nothing, but there was a knowing glint in his eye. "Yes, sir," Wade said, "I can do that." The week that followed was the longest of Wade's life. He threw himself into ranch work with unusual intensity, breaking 2 more Mustangs, repairing a section of roof on the barn that had leaked all winter, and volunteering for the pre-dawn cattle check that most hands avoided. The physical exhaustion helped quiet his thoughts during the day, but at night, lying in his bunk, he found himself remembering the details of Catherine's face, the sound of her voice, the quiet strength she carried despite, or perhaps because of, the scars of her past. By the time Harrison authorized the supply run to Pine Creek, Wade had convinced himself that his preoccupation with Catherine Forrester was nothing more than concern for a woman who had faced danger alongside him. Natural, even expected, given the circumstances. The fact that he took extra care with his appearance before departing, even borrowing a razor to ensure his face was perfectly smooth, was merely respect for his role as the ranch's representative. Pine Creek had changed in the months since Wade's last visit. New buildings had sprung up along the main street, and the settlement had a more established feel, with proper sidewalks replacing the mud paths of the previous year. Most significant was the small schoolhouse at the edge of town, its fresh pine boards still yellow against the weathered gray of older structures. Wade attended to his official business first, delivering the hardware and supplies to the men building the new corral, before allowing himself to approach the schoolhouse. The afternoon session was evidently in progress. Through the open windows, he could hear Catherine's clear voice leading a recitation of multiplication tables. Rather than interrupt, Wade tethered Coyote to a nearby hitching post and settled on a bench outside the general store, where he had a clear view of the schoolhouse door. The spring day was pleasant, the air filled with the scent of pine and new growth, and Wade found himself content to wait, observing the rhythm of the small settlement as people went about their business. When the schoolhouse door finally opened and children spilled out into the afternoon sunshine, Wade straightened, his eyes fixed on the doorway. Catherine appeared moments later, ushering the last stragglers with gentle reminders about homework. She wore a simple dress of dark gray, her blonde hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, every inch the proper schoolteacher. Then she looked up and saw him. The transformation of her expression, from weary patience to surprised delight, sent an unexpected warmth through Wade's chest. She said something to the last departing child, then walked toward him with measured steps that belied the welcome in her eyes. "Mr. McAllister," she greeted him formally, aware of the curious glances from townsfolk. "What a pleasant surprise." Wade stood, suddenly conscious of the dust on his clothes from the ride. Miss Forrester. Harrison sent me with supplies for the new corral. It wasn't the greeting he'd rehearsed in his mind, but it was safer than the alternatives. I see, she replied, a hint of amusement in her voice at his businesslike explanation. And how are things at the Double H? Well enough, Wade hesitated, then added, Mrs. Harrison asked me to inquire after your welfare. She sent some preserves and such. He gestured to the saddlebags on Coyote. Catherine's smile widened at the transparent excuse. How thoughtful. Perhaps you could bring them to my boarding house. Mrs. Whitman serves supper at 6, and she always sets an extra place for visitors. The invitation was clear, yet properly circumspect, nothing that would raise eyebrows in the small community where Catherine was establishing her reputation. I'd be obliged, Wade replied, falling into the formal dance of frontier propriety while something far less proper quickened his pulse. The boarding house run by Widow Whitman was a tidy 2-story structure with curtained windows and a small garden out front. Catherine had a room on the second floor but took her meals with the other 3 boarders, the town's barber, a clerk from the general store, and an elderly surveyor working for the railroad. Wade's arrival caused some interest, particularly from Mrs. Whitman, who surveyed him with sharp eyes before declaring that any friend of Miss Forrester's was welcome at her table. The meal was simple but well prepared, and the conversation general enough that Wade could participate without revealing much about himself. He observed how Catherine had already integrated herself into the community, addressing the other boarders by name and inquiring about their activities with genuine interest. They in turn showed her a respect that went beyond her position, a sign that she had earned their approval through her own merits rather than merely her role as teacher. After supper, it was deemed proper for Catherine to show Wade the schoolhouse, as he expressed interest in the settlement's progress. They walked the short distance in the gathering twilight, maintaining a respectable distance between them while their words bridged a more intimate gap. You seem at home here, Wade observed. The children respond well to you. Catherine's face softened at the mention of her pupils. They're wonderful, eager to learn, despite having had so little formal education. Some can barely write their names, but they try so hard, she glanced at him. I've started a special evening class for older students who work during the day, young men and women who never had the chance for schooling. That's good of you, Wade said, genuinely impressed by her dedication. Catherine shook her head. Not good, necessary. Education isn't a luxury, Wade, it's how communities grow beyond mere survival. There was passion in her voice that transformed her from pretty schoolteacher to something more compelling. It's how people like me, like these children, claim their own futures. Wade recognized in her words the same determination that had helped her survive a brutal marriage and the dangerous journey west. Catherine Forrester was not simply running from a painful past, she was running toward something, a vision of what could be. The schoolhouse was unlocked, the single room neat and ordered with rows of simple benches facing a teacher's desk. A blackboard covered one wall, still bearing the multiplication tables from the afternoon lesson. Shelves held a small collection of books, precious items in the frontier settlement. It's not much compared to Boston schools, Catherine said, lighting a lamp that cast a warm glow over the humble space. But it's a beginning. It's more than most settlements have, Wade replied. You should be proud. Catherine set the lamp on her desk and turned to face him directly, the formality of their public interaction falling away now that they were alone. I am proud, she said, but I'm also grateful. If you hadn't come along when you did on the trail, I wouldn't be here at all. Her hand unconsciously moved to her right wrist, to the scar hidden beneath her sleeve. I've had enough of being a victim, Wade. You helped me remain a survivor instead. The simple honesty of her words moved him. Wade took a step closer, close enough to see the flecks of darker blue in her eyes, the slight unevenness of her breathing. You were never a victim, he said quietly. Not really. Victims don't fight back, they don't start again, they don't build new lives. Catherine's eyes widened slightly at his assessment, as if she'd never considered this perspective. Is that how you see me, as someone who fights back? From the moment I saw you with that derringer, Wade confirmed, facing down men twice your size without backing down. A smile touched her lips at the memory. I was terrified, she admitted, but I'd learned that showing fear only makes predators bolder. The statement, delivered so matter-of-factly, reminded Wade of the burn on her wrist, of the lessons she'd learned in a marriage that had branded her both physically and emotionally. Something protective and fierce rose in him at the thought. "Catherine," he began, uncertain what he intended to say but needing to say something. She waited, patient yet expectant. When Wade found no words adequate to express the tumult of his feelings, she seemed to understand. "It's getting late," she said gently. "Mrs. Whitman will be wondering where we are." She reached for the lamp, but Wade stopped her with a light touch on her arm. "I'll be back," he said, the words emerging with more force than he'd intended. "Not just for ranch business, for," he hesitated, then finished simply, "for you." The declaration hung between them, neither a question nor a demand, but a statement of intent that surprised Wade almost as much as it seemed to affect Catherine. Her face softened, the composed schoolteacher momentarily giving way to the woman beneath. "I'll be here," she replied, the simple response carrying far more meaning than its 3 words suggested. They walked back to the boarding house in silence, the unspoken understanding between them more eloquent than any conversation could have been. At the gate, Wade took her hand briefly, a gesture that would appear properly respectful to any observers while allowing him the connection he craved. "Good night, Miss Forrester," he said for the benefit of Mrs. Whitman, visible through the front window. "Safe travels, Mr. McAllister," Catherine replied, her fingers squeezing his once before withdrawing. Wade rode back to the Double H under a canopy of stars, the same stars that had witnessed their first real conversation in the Harrisons' garden. The ranch seemed different upon his return, not the sanctuary of solitude he'd once considered it, but merely a place he stayed between visits to Pine Creek. Over the following weeks, Wade found increasingly plausible reasons to make the journey to the settlement. Sometimes he carried official ranch business, deliveries, messages, purchases, and sometimes he invented errands that Harrison indulged with knowing tolerance. Each visit followed a similar pattern, public interactions of careful propriety, followed by precious moments of private conversation in the schoolhouse or during walks along the creek that gave the settlement its name. Through these fragments of time, Wade and Catherine built a connection unlike anything Wade had experienced before. She told him of her childhood in Boston, of her father's kindness and her mother's early death. She spoke of her disastrous marriage to Theodore Forrester, a respected professor who had courted her with poetry and promises, only to reveal his true nature after the wedding. The burn on her wrist, punishment for writing a letter to a friend without permission, was only one of many injuries she had endured, most leaving scars invisible to the eye but no less permanent. In turn, Wade shared pieces of his own history that he'd never spoken aloud. The father who had taught him to track and hunt, the mother who had read Shakespeare by lamplight in their crude cabin, the years of solitary wandering after their deaths before he found a temporary home at the Double H. He told her of his belief that attachment was a luxury a man couldn't afford in the West, a philosophy that had protected him from the pain of loss but also isolated him from the warmth of connection. "And now," Catherine had asked during one such conversation as they sat on a fallen log beside the creek, watching the water flow over smooth stones, "do you still believe that?" Wade had looked at her then, really looked at the woman who had somehow breached the walls he'd built around himself, and found he could no longer remember why those walls had seemed so necessary. "No," he'd answered simply, "not anymore." Spring gave way to summer, and with it came changes to Pine Creek. The railroad survey was completed, confirming that the tracks would pass within 5 miles of the settlement, close enough to ensure growth but far enough to preserve some of the community's character. New families arrived, expanding Catherine's school to nearly 30 pupils. The Double H prospered under Harrison's management, with Wade taking on additional responsibilities that reflected his employer's growing trust. It was in late July, with the mountains still green from an unusually wet season, that Wade approached Harrison about purchasing a small parcel of land on the eastern edge of the ranch's holdings. The property included a modest cabin that had once housed a line rider, a spring-fed creek, and enough grazing land to support a small herd. Harrison had studied Wade thoughtfully before naming a fair price, less than market value, but enough to represent a serious commitment. "Planning to settle down, are you?" he'd asked, his weathered face revealing nothing. "Yes, sir," Wade had replied, meeting his employer's gaze directly. About time, Harrison had grunted, reaching for the deed papers in his desk. Was beginning to think you'd wear out a horse path to Pine Creek. The transaction complete, Wade had ridden immediately to the small property, seeing it with new eyes, not as a line rider's temporary shelter, but as the foundation for something permanent. The cabin needed work: a new roof, repairs to the stone fireplace, proper windows to replace the oilskin-covered openings. The land would need fencing, the spring a proper headgate to channel water for gardens and livestock. It was a beginning, much like Catherine's schoolhouse, a place to build something that went beyond mere survival. The next day, Wade rode to Pine Creek with the deed in his pocket and a question in his heart. He found Catherine where he expected, in the schoolhouse, preparing lessons for the fall term that would begin in a few weeks. She looked up at his entrance, her face lighting with the smile that never failed to quicken his pulse, then sobering as she registered his unusual tension. "Wade, is something wrong?" He shook his head, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. In all their conversations, they had never explicitly discussed a future together. Their connection had grown organically, founded on mutual respect and deepening affection, but neither had put a name to what was developing between them. "I bought land," he said abruptly. "East of the Double H there's a cabin. It needs work," but he stopped, frustrated by his own inarticulateness. Catherine set down her chalk, giving him her full attention. "Your own ranch?" she asked, a note of something hope, perhaps, in her voice. "It could be," Wade said. "Not large, but enough to start, enough to build on." He took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket for the deed. "I wanted you to see it, to see if you thought it had potential." Catherine understood what he was really asking. She crossed the room to stand before him, close enough that he could see the pulse at her throat, the slight tremble of her hand as she accepted the paper. "When?" she asked softly. "Whenever you're ready," Wade replied. "The school term starts soon. You've made commitments here, I understand that, but after, when the time is right, I thought perhaps." He faltered, the words he'd rehearsed on the ride suddenly inadequate. Catherine looked from the deed to his face, her eyes searching his with an intensity that made pretense impossible. "Are you asking me to marry you, Wade McAllister?" The direct question, so characteristic of her straightforward nature, cleared Wade's uncertainty like sunlight burning through morning mist. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." Catherine carefully folded the deed and placed it on her desk before turning back to face him. "I need you to understand something first," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion Wade could see in her eyes. "I won't be owned again, not by anyone. If I marry, it will be as an equal partner, not as property." Wade nodded, understanding the fear behind her declaration, the memory of a marriage that had been a prison rather than a partnership. "I don't want to own you, Catherine," he said. "I want to build something with you, a life, a home. Something neither of us has had in too long." She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of deception or reservation. Then, with deliberate movements, she pushed up her right sleeve, exposing the burn scar that circled her wrist. "This is part of who I am," she said. "The scars you can't see go deeper. I have nightmares sometimes. I flinch at sudden movements. I may always carry these things." Wade reached out slowly, telegraphing his movements, and gently took her hand. His thumb traced the ridged tissue of the scar, not with pity but with acceptance. "We all have scars," he said quietly. "Some are just more visible than others." He turned her hand and pressed a kiss to the inside of her wrist where the skin was pale and unmarked. "You are more than what was done to you. You always have been." Tears welled in Catherine's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to the land, yes to building something together. Yes to you, Wade McAllister." The kiss that followed was their first, a cautious melding of lips that quickly deepened into something more profound, a physical expression of the bond that had been growing between them since that first meeting on the trail. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have a ring," he admitted. Catherine laughed softly. "I don't need one, I need this." She pressed her hand to his chest, over his heart. "And this," she gestured to the deed on the desk, "a place to belong, a future to build." They were married 2 weeks later in Pine Creek's small church, with Harrison and his wife standing as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, the celebration modest, a supper at the boarding house with the inhabitants of Pine Creek who had come to respect the schoolteacher and the quiet cowboy who had courted her with such steady devotion. Catherine continued teaching through the fall term while Wade worked on the cabin, transforming it from a rudimentary shelter into a proper home. He built furniture from pine and aspen, a table with matching chairs, a bedstead large enough for two, shelves for Catherine's books, a rocking chair for the porch where they could watch the sunset over the mountains. Harrison provided a wedding gift of 6 head of cattle and a milk cow, the nucleus of what would become the McAllister Ranch. When the school term ended in December, Catherine moved from her room at the boarding house to the cabin that Wade had prepared with such care. The day of her arrival, snow dusted the ground, and the mountains stood white against the clear blue sky. Wade had ridden to Pine Creek to collect her and her belongings, filling the wagon with trunks containing her clothes, books, and the few treasures she had brought from Boston. As they approached the property, Catherine leaned forward on the wagon seat, her eyes taking in the transformation Wade had wrought. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, promising warmth within. New windows gleamed in the winter sunlight, curtains visible behind the glass. A fence surrounded a small garden plot, now dormant for winter but ready for spring planting. Beyond, a corral held the horses and the milk cow, while the small herd grazed in the protected valley to the east. "Oh, Wade," she breathed, "it's perfect." He helped her down from the wagon, then, in a gesture that made her laugh with delight, swept her into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their home. Inside, the cabin was warm from the fire he'd built earlier, the simple furnishings arranged to create a space that was both functional and welcoming. "Welcome home, Mrs. McAllister," he said, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. Catherine turned in his embrace, her face radiant with happiness. "Our home," she corrected, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. That night, as they lay together in the bed Wade had crafted with his own hands, Catherine traced the scar on his shoulder, the result of a knife fight in his wandering years that he'd told her about during one of their conversations by the creek. "We match," she said softly, then guided his hand to her wrist, where the burn mark remained a permanent reminder of her past. Wade understood what she meant. They were both survivors, marked by their experiences but not defined by them. In finding each other, they had discovered not just love, but a kind of healing neither had thought possible. "We do," he agreed, drawing her closer. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the land in pristine white. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light over the beginning of their shared life. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The railroad's arrival brought growth to Pine Creek and new markets for the McAllister Ranch's expanding herd. Catherine continued to teach, riding the 3 miles to town when weather permitted, staying with Mrs. Whitman during the worst of winter storms. Their small herd grew, as did their home, Wade adding rooms as their needs expanded, including a nursery for the daughter who arrived in their 2nd year of marriage, a girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's blue eyes whom they named Elizabeth after Catherine's mother. The burn mark on Catherine's wrist faded slightly with time but never disappeared completely. Sometimes, when nightmares of her first marriage surfaced, Wade would hold her, tracing the scar gently until her breathing steadied and she could sleep again. Other times, she would do the same for him when memories of his solitary years left him restless in the dark. They were not perfect, they argued, they misunderstood, they occasionally hurt each other with careless words or thoughtless actions. But they had built something stronger than either had believed possible in that first encounter on the trail. A partnership founded on mutual respect, deepened by shared struggles, and sustained by a love that had healed wounds they'd thought permanent. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Wade presented Catherine with a gift, a small silver bracelet sized to cover the burn scar on her wrist. Not to hide it, he explained, but to remind her that while the past was part of their story, it did not control their future. Catherine accepted the bracelet with tears in her eyes, then showed Wade her own gift to him. The deed to their land, now expanded to include adjoining parcels they had gradually acquired, officially registered as the McAllister Ranch. No longer just Wade's property but their shared legacy, something to pass on to Elizabeth and the children who might follow. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson, Elizabeth playing with wooden animals Wade had carved for her, Catherine leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked softly. when you saw me on the trail that day, facing down those men with nothing but a derringer and desperate courage." Wade looked at their home, the garden now lush with summer vegetables, the corral where his prized buckskin mare grazed with her new foal, the smokehouse and barn, and all the signs of prosperity they had built together. He thought of the frightened, determined young woman who had hidden her scars beneath long sleeves and the lonely cowboy who had believed attachment was a luxury he couldn't afford. "No," he admitted, drawing her closer. "I couldn't have imagined this. I didn't know how to dream this big." Catherine smiled, turning her face up to his. The silver bracelet caught the fading light as she raised her hand to touch his cheek. "I'm glad we learned together." As the sun slipped behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Wade McAllister held his family close and silently thanked whatever fate or providence had led him to that bend in the trail where a brave woman with scars both visible and hidden had changed the course of his life forever.